Father Benedetto had known Salvatore Greco for 26 years, and he had learned, in that time, the particular grammar of powerful men in decline. There was always a narrowing. The rooms got fewer, the visitors thinned to the essential. The voice that had once settled arguments across a long table reduced itself, by degrees, to something quieter, not weaker, never weaker, but distilled, as if the man were burning down to whatever was truest in him, the way a candle burns to its center. He had watched this happen to Salvatore over the course of a summer. Villa Serrano had been the family's country seat for 4 generations. Stone, walls thick enough to keep out both cold and noise, gardens that had outlived 3 renovations, a library where the light came in sideways through tall windows and fell across the same oak desk, where Salvatore had signed papers that rearranged the fortunes of families across 3 counties. The house still smelled of beeswax and old stone, and in the east wing now, of cut flowers and the particular medicinal tidiness of a sick room kept well. Salvatore had asked for the room with the garden view. He had not asked for much else. His son Marco came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, driving up from the city with his wife Renata, who moved through the villa the way water moves through a channel, always seeking the lowest point, always finding her way to whatever room held the most weight. She was efficient and pleasant and well-dressed, and Father Benedetto had watched her for months, with the attentiveness of a man who has spent a quarter-century in the company of the powerful, and who has learned to distinguish between those who love and those who position. Renata positioned. She had already spoken twice to the family's primary solicitor. She had already suggested, gently, that the estate management might benefit from her particular oversight. She had already navigated the relationships between Salvatore's 3 surviving children with the precision of a woman who understood that the geography of an inheritance is mapped long before the lawyers arrive. Salvatore, from his bed with the garden view, watched all of this and said nothing. That was the thing about him, even now. The stillness. The room still organized itself around him the way iron filings organize around a magnet, not because he commanded it, but because some quality in him made it impossible to forget he was there. His sons and daughters spoke more carefully in his presence. Renata's pleasantness took on, in his company, a slightly heightened quality. The way music played for an audience differs from music played alone. He saw it. He had always seen it. He simply had not until now understood what to do with what he saw. The nurse arrived on a Monday. Her name was Celia. She came from the hospice referral service, assigned for the final phase of Salvatore's care. A compact woman of middle years, with the economical movements of someone who has learned not to waste effort, and the specific quality of unhurriedness that distinguished genuine competence from its performance. She carried her bag in, without ceremony. She introduced herself to Salvatore directly, not to the family first, which was either a professional habit or a statement of something. Father Benedetto was not sure which. She checked his chart. She asked him 4 questions, waited for the full answer to each, and adjusted his afternoon medication schedule based on what he told her. She noted the adjustment in the chart without explaining herself to the family members present, because they had not asked. Marco asked, afterward, what her name was. None of them had caught it the first time. She came each morning at 7. She worked without commentary. When Salvatore's youngest daughter wept in the corridor, Celia brought her a glass of water and said nothing, which was precisely right. When Renata asked, in her pleasant way, whether the medication schedule could be revised to allow Salvatore to be more alert for the afternoon visits, the implication being that the family visits were the thing of consequence, and Salvatore's comfort secondary, Celia said, without unkindness, that the schedule was designed around the patient's rest requirements, and she was not able to revise it for convenience. Renata smiled and said of course, she understood completely, she did not forget it. Salvatore, who had heard the exchange through the half-open door, said nothing about it to anyone. He began in the second week to talk to Celia during the morning routines. Not about his family, not about the estate, not about the weight of what he was leaving behind. He talked about the garden, a rosebush his wife Elena had planted 30 years ago that had survived everything, drought and hard winters, and a renovation that came within 2 feet of removing it. He talked about a particular afternoon in the mountains, when Marco was small, before the weight of the family's business had settled fully onto his shoulders, when the only thing that mattered was a boy learning to fish in cold water. He talked about Elena's hands, the way she had held a coffee cup. Celia listened. She did not offer comfort or perspective or gentle reframing. She simply listened and asked occasional precise questions, and it became clear to Father Benedetto, who heard some of this through the open door, more of it from Salvatore himself in their afternoon visits, that what Salvatore was doing, in those morning conversations, was the thing he had not been able to do in the presence of anyone who needed something from him. He was being honest. The request came on a Thursday. Father Benedetto was not present. He learned of it afterward, first from Celia and then, in fragments, from Salvatore himself. There was a woman, a former housekeeper, Antonia, who had worked at Villa Serrano for 11 years before a disagreement with Renata had resulted, 18 months prior, in her quiet removal from the household. She had been loyal to Elena. She had been kind to the children when they were small. Salvatore had said nothing at the time of her dismissal because it had occurred during a period when his illness was first becoming difficult to manage, and his attention had been elsewhere, and he had never forgiven himself the silence. He wanted to see her, not the lawyers, not a formal reconciliation for the family's witnessing. He wanted Antonia brought to the villa privately, to sit with him for an afternoon and to be told, by him simply, that he had been wrong to say nothing, and that he was sorry. He asked Celia to arrange it. He asked her because she was the only person in the house who could do it, without it becoming something other than what it was. Marco would involve the family, and it would become theater. His daughters would mean well, and it would become complicated. Renata would find a way to make it impossible. Celia said she would see what she could do. What she could do involved driving 40 minutes on her day off to find Antonia's address from a mutual acquaintance, calling her herself, explaining the request plainly, and driving her to the villa the following Saturday morning in her own car. She said nothing to the family about it. She brought Antonia through the garden entrance. She sat in the corridor while the two of them spent an hour together, and she drove Antonia home afterward. Renata found out on Sunday. She spoke to Marco about the appropriateness of the nurse involving herself in family matters. Marco, who was not a bad man but who had learned over years to defer to his wife's navigations, agreed it was a concern. A call was made to the hospice service, framed politely, suggesting that a different nurse might be a better fit. Salvatore learned of this on Monday morning. He asked Celia, when she arrived, whether the call had been made. She said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her to send for his solicitor. Father Benedetto arrived that afternoon to find the solicitor's car in the drive. He waited in the garden. The rosebush Elena had planted was still blooming, late in the season, a thing that struck him as the kind of detail that would stay with him. The solicitor emerged after an hour, nodded to Father Benedetto without speaking, and drove away. Salvatore asked for the priest that evening. He was tired. The deep tiredness that Father Benedetto had learned to distinguish from ordinary fatigue, the tiredness that is the body's slow negotiation with what is coming. But his mind was clear, and his voice, though quieter than it had been, still carried that quality of a man who has said difficult things for so long that difficulty no longer changes his register. He told Father Benedetto what he had done. He had added a codicil to the will, a provision for Celia, a sum sufficient to allow her to open the independent practice she had mentioned once, in passing, as a thing she had put away because it was not practical. He had also, in a separate letter to be delivered after the reading, written to Antonia directly, not as the head of a family, not with ceremony, as himself. Father Benedetto asked him why he had not simply called off the complaint to the hospice service. Salvatore said, "I did that too, but a man should not only remove harm, he should also leave something." He died 4 days later, on a Tuesday, in the early morning, with the garden visible through the window and the rosebush just past bloom in the September light. Celia was present. She had stayed through the night, not because anyone asked her to, but because she understood that the end of something important should not find a person alone. The will was read in the library on the following Friday. Renata was present, in a dark dress, with the composed attention of a woman who has prepared carefully for a moment. Marco sat beside her. The 3 children filled the chairs near the window. The solicitor read. The estate was distributed as expected, fairly, with the specific provisions Salvatore had made over years for each of his children. The charitable endowments, the agricultural properties, the matter of the city offices, and then the codicil. Renata heard it read aloud, the provision for Celia. The reasoning stated plainly in Salvatore's own words, which the solicitor read without inflection. She was honest with me when honesty cost her something. That is rarer than most things I have spent my life acquiring, and it should not go unrewarded. The room was quiet. Renata said nothing. There was nothing to be said. The document was legal and witnessed, and the handwriting was Salvatore's own, firm to the last line, the hand of a man who had signed his name to consequential things for 60 years, and knew how to make a signature final. Marco looked at his hands. The children were still. Father Benedetto, standing near the door, watched Renata's face in the moment after the reading and saw the precise thing he had been watching for. Not anger, not grief, but the particular recalibration of a person who has understood too late that they misidentified the important thing in the room. Celia was not at the reading. She had not been invited, and she had not expected to be. The solicitor found her at her next assignment. Another patient, another family, another house that smelled of flowers and medicine and the particular tenderness of endings. He explained the provision. He gave her the paperwork. She sat with it for a long time. She had not done what she did for Salvatore Greco, in expectation of anything. She had brought Antonia to the villa because a man she respected had asked her to, and because it was right, and because the rightness of it was obvious to her, in the way that things are obvious to people who have spent their working lives in rooms where everything is stripped down to what is real. She had not known he was watching. She had not known that the most feared man in 3 counties, the man whose name closed doors and opened them, whose loyalty was the only currency that mattered, had spent the last weeks of his life paying attention to the one person in the house who wanted nothing from him. Father Benedetto, when he learned she had received the news, drove to find her. He was not sure what he meant to say. He found her in the garden of her patient's house, sitting in the afternoon light with a cup of tea, and he sat down beside her without ceremony. He said, "He talked about you." At the end, he said you reminded him of Elena. She looked at the garden. He said, "I asked him once what Elena had that no one else had." He said, "She was never afraid of me, and she never needed anything from me, and so I could always trust what she said was true." Celia held her cup. He said, "I think the last request was not really about Antonia," she said, quietly. "I know." They sat in the afternoon light, the old priest and the unremarkable nurse, and the garden was very still. And somewhere in it, something continued to bloom past the season it was supposed to. The way some things do, the way some kindnesses do, persisting past the life that planted them, stubbornly, without needing anyone's permission.